Okay, perfect. Okay, welcome everybody to another MCRN Colloquium. Today we've got Professor Michael Robert from Virginia Tech presenting. He got his PhD in biomathematics at North Carolina State University. And his research is focused on analyzing mathematical models to study biological phenomena, models for ecological, evolutionary, meteorological, environmental, and anthropogenic processes underlying the emergence, spread, and control of infectious diseases. And today he'll be speaking to us about some of these models on climatic drivers of mosquito-borne disease emergence, the special case of dengue fever in Central Argentina. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And with that, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks everyone for having me here and for coming today. I know there's a timing at the end of the semester is busy, so I appreciate everyone who's here. I'm happy to sort of stop and take questions along the way if people have questions. I'll keep my eye on the chat, but I will admit that my experience with meat is a little bit. I'm a bit of a novice there, so in terms of like raising your hand or something, just feel free to interrupt me if that's easier. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've been thinking about climate in models of mosquito-borne disease transmission, and I think partially just due to sort of timing and where most of my interest has been, I'm going to focus a lot on temperature, but I'm very curious to sort of get other people's perspectives on other ways of including climate in these types of models. Oops. So I want to start off just quickly by saying that the work that I'm going to talk about today is actually a product of work with a lot of people across different countries and over almost a decade now of work. So namely, I want to sort of point out that this group up here is a group of people led by Elizabeth Estagio, who is a researcher at CONICET Argentina, who is based, physically based at the National University of Córdoba, which is in Central Argentina, which I will talk quite a bit about because that's where most of our data comes from for this study. Some other sort of work that I will sort of talk about that's related to this work comes from a study that I've been a part of with a group based out of Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. So that's led by Manuel Colome Hidalgo. And then I will say that I've been working with a few undergraduate students here at Virginia Tech who have also contributed a bit to this work. Some of the work, especially that towards the end, will be work done by my PhD students, Morgan Jackson, who just defended last week, and Sahil, who will defend sometime in the fall. And then some of the work that I am going to talk about started with my postdoc advisor, actually Helen Waring, who's at University of New Mexico, and our collaborator, Becky Christofferson. And although I won't really talk much about their work, Sushi Sridhar is another graduate student of mine who's working with me, and Ezra Toy and Luis Escobar here at Virginia Tech, who's picking up some of the work that I'm going to talk about. And I also just want to point out that some of the data that I'll present was collected not only by the graduate students and postdocs who are based at National University of Córdoba, but by some technicians as well. So this is a slightly diverse group from my understanding. So I'll sort of orient you a little bit with where I'm thinking about my work. And so all of this is grounded in thinking about mosquito-borne diseases, which are a major problem globally. There are something on the order of 300 million plus cases of various mosquito-borne diseases every year. And this number ranges quite a bit. And I should point out that these are the cases that are typically reported. So there's often quite a lot more cases that are actually happening. Of these, malaria and dengue are the sort of biggest two. And I'm going to focus particularly on dengue. And dengue is a mosquito-borne disease that is transmitted primarily by a species of mosquito known as Aedes aegypti. There's a sort of cousin species called Aedes albopictus that also transmits dengue in some parts of the world. But the work that I'm going to do today is largely focused on Aedes aegypti, and I'll explain why. In terms of dengue, it's sort of largely concentrated across the central region of the world. And this central region sort of being largely tropical, subtropical. This is the mosquito. So this particular mosquito is an anthropophilic, one day I'll learn how to say that word correctly, but anthropophilic urban mosquito species. So it really likes sort of being in and around human houses. It prefers to feed on humans over other species, which is part of what actually makes it a really good vector of several pathogens. It transmits the pathogens that cause Zika, chikungunya, Mayaro, and also yellow fever virus. And these are just a couple of habitats that we've sort of seen across different sampling sites where we've seen Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. This is the distribution of Aedes aegypti, which largely overlaps with where we just saw the dengue distribution. And I'll just point out that Aedes aegypti is in the US in several places. I will say, however, that this map, I think, is more of a sort of likelihood of presence absence versus an absolute presence absence. And so these are regions where it is very likely to see Aedes aegypti, and not necessarily places that Aedes aegypti has been detected, particularly in sort of these northern regions here. But Aedes aegypti is found largely sort of closer to the coastal regions and cities on the southeast, and then in parts of sort of the southwest as well. And it keeps kind of creeping up and showing up in more places. Recently, it's been showing up a little bit more sort of in just north of Southern California. This map is a little bit outdated, but this sort of helps us have an idea of why dengue is a problem and sort of how quickly it has spread over the last 40 years or so. And so back in sort of 1970, dengue was found in about 9 countries. It has since spread, and not only has it spread, there have been sort of several different serotypes of the virus have spread across this central sort of tropical, subtropical region. And it's gone from being in about 9 countries to actually being in over 130 countries today. There's a couple of reasons that dengue is spreading. So urbanization is a big part of it. So there are a lot of urban areas that are getting more and more sort of densely populated, and this mosquito, being a fan of humans, appreciates, I guess, the urbanization in some ways. And this also just sort of makes it a little bit easier for the infection to spread when there are more people around. Increases in global travel. I think, we saw this with COVID, and it's true for other infections as well. So diseases can move farther, faster these days, in part due to global travel. The mosquito species has also expanded its distribution, and part of this is related to changes in climate. But the virus itself is also spreading in part due to changes in climate, or at least it's doing better in some places due to these changes. And as with a lot of sort of mosquito-borne diseases, development of insecticide resistance is also causing a problem for control, which then leads to increases in infection. Although all of these things are important, I'm going to zoom in on changes in climate for this talk. I think, for obvious reasons, and then also this is where a lot of my work has been over the last sort of half of a decade. To sort of zoom in a little bit from that global perspective to the Americas, this sort of gives you, I hope, an appreciation for the increase in dengue cases over the last couple of years. So the sort of yellow gold curve here is an average of the yearly dengue cases in the 5 years starting in 2022 back to 2017. In 2023, there was a very large outbreak across all of the Americas. And in 2024, we saw the largest outbreak that has ever been recorded across this region. Zooming in a little bit more to South America, you'll notice the shapes of these curves are very similar. And it turns out a large part of the driver of the outbreak in the Americas this time was actually focused in South America. And so this is a curve, particularly from the southern cone, which includes Argentina, parts of Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. I'll say it also includes Chile, but so the definition of the southern cone includes Chile. However, there have been no reported cases of locally transmitted dengue in Chile yet. But you can see that sort of same trend and increases is visible here. Zooming in just a little bit more into Argentina, so the dengue outbreaks in Argentina first started back in the late 90s and were largely concentrated in these northern provinces, which often have at least subtropical weather patterns. In 2009, the first sort of large-scale outbreak across the country occurred. And so you can see here the incidence in these northern provinces increased quite a bit. That's sort of indicated by the darker red here. But sort of importantly, we also saw that more cases started to show up farther south. And so this is Córdoba province that I have the pointer on at the moment. And to give you just a little bit of a perspective here, Córdoba is sort of at a similar latitude below the equator as, say, like Fort Worth or Dallas is above the equator. And so importantly here, these four provinces in particular reported dengue outbreaks. These sort of other provinces reported mostly dengue cases that had been acquired elsewhere, but were sort of reported in these provinces. Then, as you can see, in 2016, this started to spread a little bit more. So now there were cases that were actually happening over here. And in 2020, most of the provinces sort of at this line of latitude and above had reported local transmission of dengue. So this is something that in Argentina has been getting worse and worse. And we'll sort of see, even though I don't have the figure here, 2024 was a particularly bad year. So zooming in yet again to Córdoba, the city. So in Argentina, Córdoba province is here in green. Córdoba city is where we're going to sort of focus the rest of the talk, and it's sort of here in the sort of northern part of the province. To give you a little bit of perspective here, here's the Tropic of Capricorn and Paraguay, Uruguay, to sort of orient you just a little bit. But in terms of the cases in Córdoba, I have this sort of inset here to sort of to indicate that you know, in the first 9 to 10 years of dengue transmission in Córdoba, it was definitely getting worse. But each subsequent outbreak was just a little bit bigger than the previous outbreak, with at the time 2016 being the largest outbreak with an incidence of about 60 cases per 100,000 people. Zooming out a little bit and looking at 2016 compared to 2020, 2023, and 2024, we can see that there's been quite a huge increase in terms of incidence in Córdoba. And I believe there were something on the order of 60,000 plus cases of dengue in Córdoba city in 2024, and over 120,000 or so in the province. So I am interested in a lot of different pieces of what's going on here. And part of what I'm really interested in is thinking about how we can use models to help us understand how dengue is spreading and emerging in these new places. I'm also really interested in all of the different data sources that are out there. So there's lots of climate data that's easier to get to now. There's lots of social media data. There's Google Trends data. You know, I hate kind of saying this, but you know, we live in this time of lots and lots of data, right? It's something people say a lot. And I'm interested in how we can use all of that to help us think about disease spread and in particular, how we might be able to use these sort of data streams to think about something called early warning systems that can help us predict when we might see more cases of dengue and other mosquito-borne diseases, so that we can work with local vector control and health departments. So this is a modeling approach that maybe many of you are familiar with in terms of weather models, at least. So that the idea that I'm kind of interested in is how we can make use of a bunch of different types of models to get a range of predictions on what we might see in terms of outbreaks or sort of periods of risk even for outbreaks. And I use this example a lot to sort of make the connection between hurricane projection models that we often see on TV versus all the sort of models and the ensemble of models that go into those projections. And this is kind of the long-term goal of what I'm doing, but I'm still very much in the early stages of this. So the idea here is that we'll take a bunch of these different data that we can get, things that we get online, things that we get from our collaborators. We'll put them into a series of different types of models. My talk today is going to mostly focus on mathematical models, but I've been working with collaborators and students on all of these different types of modeling approaches here. And then we can look at a bunch of different outputs that we're interested in. So things like entomological indices, how many mosquitoes per house do we have in a neighborhood, or epidemiological metrics like number of cases or time of peak outbreak, case counts, things like this. And then ultimately, one of the goals is to start using these outputs to help us think about the data that we're collecting or the data that we need to continue improving these models. So I'm going to start first by thinking about some of the reasons that we're very interested in temperature and climate and how these things impact dengue. And this is work largely with everyone that you see here, including my co-PI, Elizabeth Estagio, and her team, as well as Morgan Jackson, my PhD student. So I showed you this picture on top earlier of dengue spread in Argentina, and particularly in Central Argentina. Our group, led by Soledad Lopez, actually also looked at trends in temperature and trends in precipitation between 1960 and 2020. And we were able to see a couple of interesting things. And I'm going to sort of zoom in here on minimum temperature. But we can see that largely these red areas, which indicate sort of warmer places that have warmed up, are largely in the same general region as these places where we've seen increases in dengue cases across time. There are a couple of exceptions here where, for instance, here there's actually been some cooling within this province, but that is definitely the exception to all of the warming that we've seen. You may also notice here that precipitation has increased in places, but also decreased in places. And precipitation and its relationship with mosquito-borne diseases is actually quite tricky because mosquitoes require water to complete their life cycle. So often having more water is better for the mosquito population. However, having too much water from like floods or monsoons can actually wash out the mosquito populations from their habitats. And on the other end of that, not enough water, so drought periods, can actually result in people sort of storing water outside, which then creates habitat for mosquitoes. So this is one reason why I haven't done much yet with precipitation, and then another reason why it's often difficult to draw conclusions between precipitation and dengue spread and mosquito populations. I will say that this study was definitely part of a preliminary study, and so at the time of this work, we did not draw many significant conclusions here between climate and dengue spread. But we definitely see some trends in warming that seem to be associated, or sorry, we see some trends and increases in dengue that seem to be associated with the warming. There are a couple of reasons why temperature and dengue and the mosquito population are related, and I'll sort of point out here that these places where we see dengue are largely some of the warmest places on the globe. In terms of this, there's a number of other things that are going on in this region of the world that also contribute to dengue. So in particular, socioeconomic status plays a big role. Housing structure, infrastructure plays a big role. Other climate variables aside from temperature are also important. So I just want to mention that I recognize that there are a lot of other things going on here aside from temperature, but I'm going to focus what I'm doing in terms of temperature. So in our first study looking for significant relationships between climate variables and dengue in Argentina, we sort of cobbled together a bunch of data that had been provided to us for a large-scale analysis of lags between data, correlation and lags between data. And we found a couple of things here. In particular, we found that the sort of mean temperature and the number of eggs were positively correlated at the same sort of time points. And then minimum temperature and the number of, or the percentage of neighborhoods that were positive for mosquitoes were also positively correlated at the same time points. This was our initial finding across a bunch of different data sets, and you can see here, and I haven't shown all of the different studies that we did, but a lot of things showed up as not significant. And part of this, we think anyway, is just due to the resolution of the data that we had. And so I'll talk a little bit more about how we're working on getting better mosquito data and better dengue data to work with in the future. Just a couple other things here. So we looked at some trends from another perspective, looked at trends in things like temperature and precipitation, and sort of found these weak relationships here between peaks away from average temperatures, so these anomalies in temperatures that are leading to higher temperatures, and the timing of all of these outbreaks that were observed between 2009 and 2020. And then we need to sort of revisit this again with the more recent outbreaks. There's a lot of basis for this kind of work in endemic places, so places where dengue has been around for a lot longer. And one of those places is the Dominican Republic, where dengue has been endemic for over 40 years or so. And there have been a couple of particularly bad outbreaks in the last decade that have coincided with some of the other data that I showed you earlier in terms of large outbreaks in South America. And I'll just point out a couple of things here. So we did another study of the correlation and lags between various climate variables and dengue cases in 9 locations in the Dominican Republic. And here we actually found that humidity played a really big role in preceding the dengue outbreaks that we had in the time period between 2014 and 2020. And in particular, there were a couple of, so these two are, I think, are a little harder to explain, but there's a couple here where effectively increases in humidity sort of 10 weeks out were associated with, or positively associated with dengue cases. This is mean humidity and sort of mean weekly humidity range. Maximum weekly humidity actually had an opposite relationship. And we're still sort of thinking about the discrepancies here across these different results. And then in this study, at least, we found that one province, there was a relationship there between the maximum weekly temperature and dengue cases that was important, about 4 weeks ahead of time. So increases in temperature were associated with increases in dengue cases. Although the relationship was significant, it wasn't incredibly strong. There have been a number of other studies that have found sort of variations of these relationships in different places. Okay, so how does temperature impact dengue and the mosquito population in particular? This is a mosquito life cycle for, or I should say maybe a typical sort of insect life cycle applied to mosquitoes. There's an egg, larvae, pupae, and adult stage. And many of these things are affected by temperature. So these are three in particular. These figures come from a paper written by Aaron Mordecai back in 2017, where they did a meta-analysis of relationships between different traits in mosquitoes and temperature. And so in particular, we see here that there's an optimum kind of temperature for fecundity, mosquito development rate, adult lifespan, and sort of beyond that optimum, or before you get to that optimum, there are sort of lower values of these different traits. There's also temperature impacts on the transmission cycle. And so just to orient you to how dengue gets transmitted here, we start with, for example, an infectious human. So an infectious human gets bitten by a mosquito. That mosquito then has to undergo an incubation period. After the mosquito survives that incubation period, it is now infectious and can bite a susceptible human, and sort of restarting that cycle. Temperature can actually impact multiple stages of this process. So the one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is the effect of temperature on the incubation rate in the mosquito. And so in particular, there's evidence to show that the warmer it gets, the faster the virus incubates. So that is not particularly good news for warming. But there's also these relationships between transmission and infection probabilities, as well as like how frequently the mosquitoes bite. I will point out here, I take some issues with this particular figure. The curves fit here are Briere curves that basically assume some sort of thermodynamic process and assume a maximum that ultimately goes back down at a high temperature. However, there seems to only be one data point for this particular figure. And so I recognize there are some issues here, but we're going to use it for now. So all this to say is that the temperature impacts various stages of the infection process, as well as various stages of the mosquito life cycle. And here's sort of a collection of these different traits. So I've shown you biting rate and transmission probability, infection probability, incubation rate. There are a number of other rates here and traits that are affected by temperature. So kind of going back to some of the questions that I've been thinking about, and sort of zooming in a little bit on questions that I've been particularly interested in recently. So we have all of these relationships between temperature and these different traits. Because I've been really interested in what's been going on in Cordova, which is largely a place that has a fairly temperate climate, I'm very interested in how seasonality impacts the ability of dengue and other mosquito-borne diseases to spread and emerge and become established in these temperate regions. And so one thing that I think quite a bit about is sort of how does the seasonal variation in temperature actually impact risk and the quote unquote window of risk for outbreaks. And then how can we actually use what we know about temperature and its effects on dengue now to think about what's going to happen in the future, in particular if temperatures continue to increase. And then another question that I'm not really going to deal with much here, but that my PhD student Morgan spent a lot of time thinking about, is actually if we can incorporate all of these different traits into our models, which ones are the most important? I think that is interesting to think about in terms of the data that's available, and also sort of building parsimonious models that can do a good job of describing the mosquito population dynamics and the dengue dynamics. So I'm going to focus on these first two questions largely for now, but I'm happy to chat about the others as well. And so this work actually started back when I was a postdoc, thinking more generally about seasonality and dengue spread. So I'm going to kind of step through that a little bit quickly and then talk about what we've done in Argentina. So to ground this a little bit in the mathematical modeling, I'm going to be working with a deterministic host vector epidemiological model. It's a very traditional SIR type model that's described by differential equations. And the way that we work with this model is we take both the mosquito population and the human population, and we break them up by infection status. So for instance, in the mosquito population, we have susceptible, exposed, and infectious. Susceptible are the mosquitoes who have not yet acquired dengue, but can get it. Exposed are the ones who are infected, but not infectious. So this is where the incubation period typically happens. And then the I class is the infectious class. So this is where the mosquitoes can actually start transmitting the pathogen to humans, which we sort of denote here with this arrow. And the human population has similar categories for susceptible, exposed, infectious. And we also assume that humans can recover. So dengue, when you get infected with one type of dengue, you usually get long-term immunity to that type. And temporary immunity to the other types. So for the time frame that we're thinking about here, it makes sense to allow everyone to be fully recovered. Because I'm really interested in how mosquito population dynamics are affected by temperature, I also add another layer to this model of mosquito population dynamics. And so what I forgot in this particular version of the model is that there's actually an egg compartment as well. So we have eggs, all of our juvenile stages, the pupal stage, and that feeds into the adult population. Everything that I have here in orange is something that we're going to think about being controlled by temperature explicitly in the model. So math talk, I should probably show some equations and prove that I do a little bit of math. And so these are the differential equations that we use, and these are specifically for the adult mosquito population, but know that there are similar equations for the humans as well. And so in terms of how we connect these different parts of the model to the data, this is the susceptible mosquito population, which will increase as we get new adult mosquitoes into the population. And that is controlled by this temperature-dependent mosquito development rate. There's also this transmission process. So this alpha value sort of encapsulates both the biting rate and the infection probability for transmission from humans to mosquitoes. And that is indicated here in blue. And so that would say that we would lose our susceptible mosquitoes that would then become exposed based on this biting rate and infection probability. Once infected, the mosquitoes go through an incubation period. And so they move out of the exposed into the infectious class at some rate here that we define using this curve. And then the mosquitoes at all stages have a temperature-dependent mortality rate, and that is controlled by the inverse of this lifespan function here. To simplify things for this, we allow the temperature variation to occur based on a cosine curve that we fit to average temperature data. We've been working with ways of sort of incorporating the data a little bit more explicitly into these models, but for what I'm going to show you now, we're going to use this sort of simplification of the temperature dynamics. Okay, so I mentioned that some of this work actually started a while ago before I even started working in Cordova, and some of the modeling work that I've done has been motivated by this paper that I did with my postdoc advisor, Helen Waring, where we actually started with 6 places in the US and Puerto Rico and looked at the temperature patterns in each of these cities, each of these 6 cities. And we chose these based on a number of reasons. So for instance, Miami and San Juan have fairly tropical and subtropical temperatures across the year, whereas places like New Orleans and El Paso and Atlanta have much more seasonal patterns in temperature. And these are all places where Aedes aegypti has been found. So that was another kind of motivating factor here for the work that we're doing. So the first thing that we looked at here, and I've reproduced the temperature curve down here just for reference, but the first thing that we looked at here was how temperature impacts things like the incubation period and the adult mosquito lifespan. And so I obviously don't have time to go through all of these individually, but I'll point out a few things here. So in particular in San Juan and Miami, where these temperatures are fairly warm year round, we notice that mosquito lifespan is quite high. There's a little bit of a dip actually in the summer months because it gets too warm. And one thing to notice here is that even though the sort of average temperatures in February, for instance, between Miami and San Juan are quite different, the adult mosquito lifespan is actually quite similar. In places like Atlanta and El Paso and New Orleans, we see much lower lifespan in the colder months with very similar and sometimes even higher lifespans for those mosquitoes in the summer months. For the incubation period, the effect is quite similar, but flipped. And so, for instance, the incubation period is quite short when it is warmer. And so in San Juan, the incubation period is quite short year round, whereas in Miami, it's quite short in the summer months, but much longer in the winter months. And importantly, in many of these other places, there's only a small window of when the incubation period is short. And so it turns out that these relationships between short incubation periods and long lifespans are very, very important because the mosquito has to be able to survive the incubation period in order to be able to transmit. We then did our best to turn this into a reasonable metric here. And this metric that I'm showing you on the y-axis is the cumulative reported incidence of dengue within 1 year of an initial introduction that occurs at the time on the horizontal axis. So let me walk you through that really quick. What we're seeing here on the vertical axis is if someone were to show up in March, for instance, in San Juan, we would then expect to see somewhere on the order of several hundred cases reported in San Juan over the course of the year that followed. Keep in mind these are reported cases, and we're also thinking about this in terms of a small population within each of these cities that is being held constant across all of the cities just to have something held constant here. So what we can see here is that the outbreak size in San Juan in particular doesn't necessarily change very much across the year. So the timing of introduction doesn't actually play a big role in what we see in terms of the outbreak. This story changes quite a bit for places like Miami and New Orleans, where the outbreaks that occur after introductions between, in Miami, for instance, March and August here, are quite a bit bigger than the outbreaks that occur, say, following introductions that occur in September, November. This is seen kind of even more in these places with more seasonal temperatures. I'll talk a little bit about New Orleans and show here that if I were to kind of draw a line here at 10 to the 0, you can kind of see that the quote unquote window of risk here for larger outbreaks is somewhere between, it is for introductions that occur somewhere between, say, April and maybe August. But outside of that, there's a much lower sort of quote unquote window of risk for transmission. We looked at this even more in terms of how these periods of risk might change and how the magnitude of the expected cases might change with warmer temperatures. And so we effectively took the average temperature of each of these places and we allowed it to increase by 0.51, 1.5 degrees Celsius, and calculated the same thing. So the total number of cases that occur in the year that follow. In general, in San Juan, we basically just saw higher temperatures led to more infections. But in places like Miami and New Orleans, Miami in particular, we saw that not only did the number of cases increase, but the time period that we might expect to see cases changes quite a bit. And this is really important because there's something happening here between 0.5 and 1 degree increase in average temperatures that takes us from Miami having only a seasonal risk of outbreaks to effectively having risk year round. And that could be really important, and particularly in Miami, where we've been seeing more and more introductions of dengue and even more small outbreaks happening in the last few years. New Orleans, kind of interestingly, only really led to sort of moderate increases in that window of risk, but pretty big increases sort of relative to the baseline case for the number of cases. So even though the period of risk might not increase dramatically, the number of cases that we might see in New Orleans with increases could be important. And New Orleans is an interesting place where there hasn't been much in the way of local dengue transmission, at least reported, but it has all of the right elements to support dengue spread. So it's a place to keep a close watch on. Okay, so
Could I ask
a
question, Michael? Sorry, this is Christian. In your last picture here, so these different curves represent 0 degrees, 0.5, +1, +1.5.
Right.
Do you mean those within 1.5 over pre-industrial, or do you mean 1.5 from now going up by 1.5? Maybe that doesn't make a difference, but.
That's a good point. So these are all added to the average temperatures over the last 30 years, so not the pre-industrial. Yeah, so these are just the increases from the current averages.
And how long do you allow for those to take place? Does that matter, or you just immediately, you just run the model with the higher temperature?
So in this model, we're just running the model with the higher temperature. So we're basically asking the question here, if we know that, for instance, this is going to be the expectation under current temperatures, what happens if the average temperature is then increased by a year? So it's not taking into account any sort of more gradual change over time, and there's no sort of enforcement of adaptation or evolution or anything across that time either. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, a part of where that's coming from is I'm interested in rate-induced tipping, and that could well be playing a role here, not just the absolute temperature, but the rate at which it changes. But that's another question, so I don't want to.
Yeah. And so we applied this methodology to thinking about dengue in Cordova. So the work that I talked about earlier was kind of inspired more by curiosity, and then as I was finishing up that work, I started working with this group in Cordova, and so this is work that my PhD student Morgan did, taking that model structure and actually fitting the model to the recent dengue outbreak where we had both temperature and case data. We got a fairly reasonable fit, at least in terms of what we were working with in the model. We were able to capture kind of the increase as well as the timing of the peak, although we're certainly not capturing the peak. And I should mention there's potentially some issues with this data and reporting. You can kind of see there's like a case, a big spike, no cases, a big spike. There were a couple of holidays in here that we think might have impacted the reporting. And for reference, this is like roughly Easter week of 2024. This point here that's quite low. So we're still working on that, but with the data that we had available, Morgan was able to fit the model to the data and then work with that as kind of a baseline for the rest of her study. And so on top of that basic differential equation model, she built a discrete time Markov chain approximation and ran a number of simulations and allowed temperature to impact all of those variables that we talked about earlier. And now, instead of thinking about the number of cases, we're thinking a little bit more, at least initially, about the probability of local transmission or the probability that at least one case happens. And let me just back up just a second. Whoops. So just as a reminder, now we've flipped hemispheres. And so the summer months are going to be on the sort of either end of the figure and the winter months in the middle. And so the probability of local transmission happening is peaking here sort of in the earlier parts of the year. So this would be sometime in February, and then there's quite a break here where actually the probability of local transmission is almost zero for most of the fall and winter months. I just said that, sorry. And we also looked at things like peak size and peak timing. And so the larger peaks of the outbreaks were following these introductions in late February. And so this is actually sort of similar to what I just showed you. So we're looking at the timing of introduction on the horizontal axis and the number of cases at the peak on the vertical axis here. In terms of duration of outbreak, we saw very similar patterns. And then we asked the same question about increases in temperature. And I think some of this, so what I'm showing you here on the left are, again, the timing of introduction on the horizontal axis and the fraction of outbreaks or the probability of having outbreaks of 10, 100, or 1,000. And this is in a population of about 10,000. We sort of scaled everything down to be able to run the model more efficiently. And we can see here that this period in the early part of the year, the probability of having outbreaks of certain sizes is very high and doesn't really change much until we get into these winter months where we actually see that we go from having basically no probability of an outbreak, a small outbreak, to having a fairly high probability of having a smaller outbreak with this increase from 0 to 2 degrees Celsius. And we see that a similar trend here with the sort of outbreaks over 100 or the outbreaks here over 1,000. In particular, with this one, the large outbreaks go from basically not happening to happening with probability, a very, very high probability in these sort of late summer months. And this is particularly interesting in Cordova because one thing that we noticed here in the model is that the outbreaks were actually lasting much longer. And so the outbreaks, even if they would start early in one year, might actually last well into the next year, which is not something that's been happening in Cordova and other central regions yet. So currently every outbreak is sort of seeded by a new introduction. And Morgan did a little bit of investigating in her model and saw that part of what was happening is that infection was the mosquitoes themselves and infection were kind of persisting now through these colder months because conditions had become favorable enough to allow for that over the winter months. And that is just based on a 2-degree increase Celsius in the temperatures. And so we thought that was particularly interesting because one thing that our group discovered last summer, our summer, but last winter for Argentina, was that the mosquito population is apparently starting to survive in all of its different life stages through the winter months. And we, one of our grad students here in Cordova, Magali, found in some traps that she had been keeping that the mosquito populations and the egg, larval, pupal, and adult stages were active throughout the winter last year. And this is the first time that this has been reported in this region, which is both interesting and a little bit troubling. I'm running out of time, but I do want to say that, you know, we worked with stochastic models, and so we did look at a lot of questions of variation. And there are a couple of caveats here. So at the moment, we're thinking about all of the temperature impacts as being instantaneous. And so one thing that I and hopefully my next PhD student will be working on are to think more about delays and distributed delays in these relationships between temperature and the traits. And something that Morgan started on that I think the next student will also take on is thinking more about heterogeneity in the population and how pockets of mosquito populations and mosquito distributions along with microclimates actually can contribute to dengue spread in the region. So my general conclusions here is that including temperature in these models, I think, has allowed us to kind of see a little bit more in terms of how we might expect risk of outbreaks to vary across the season, and it also gives us more insights into how seasonality and temperatures might be changing some of the traits that we're really interested in this process, and how we might be getting these like windows where transmission is more likely versus less likely. And all of this work, or a lot of this work, recent work, has been funded by the Borough's Welcome Fund, and as part of this, our group in Argentina is working with a number of schools to continue collecting longitudinal mosquito data and climate data. And we will hopefully have the rest of that at the end of the summer. There's a bunch of gross pictures of mosquitoes and some other things. And I should say I'm working with a group of students here at Virginia Tech to think about precipitation and humidity in these models. And hopefully the next time I give this talk, I'll be able to talk more about that. Thank you again to everybody in the group who contributed to this. This work was funded by a number of different sources. Primarily, recent work has been funded by the Borough's Welcome Fund, but all of this started with some funds from the Fulbright Commission and the U.S. Embassy in Argentina that gave me an opportunity to go down and work with Ellie for a while. And I'll leave this here. So our team has put together an Instagram page where you can follow the progress of the project. And see sort of some of the work that they're doing with the students and updates on dengue in Argentina, and you can sort of practice your Spanish if you want. And I will sort of pause here. I know we don't have much time left, but I'll be happy to pause here for any questions or discussion.
Okay, yeah, that was a very interesting talk and really fascinating data sets also to see. So I think that, it was really, really well done. So sorry. If anybody has any questions, please feel free. If not, I'm sure I have at least one. Oh, go ahead, Chris. Or sure, Seth.
Okay. Hey, Michael, do you go back to your caveat slide?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So ignores impact of precipitation, humidity, and humidity. It was just, okay, it's been a while since I've actually looked at your model when you introduced it. You had your layers of your SEI with your vector population, and you had your SEIR with your human population. Okay, so where exactly would precipitation and humidity fit? Where would you imagine that fitting in, or that idea? So.
Yeah, so precipitation in particular often leads to more habitat for the mosquito. So the the mosquito larval and egg stages all persist in water, and so often if there's more precipitation, then we might expect there to be more habitat, and so we might expect, for instance, like the carrying capacity of the populations to be larger. Humidity is a little bit more interesting because it not only kind of seems to affect some of the traits that I've already shown you, so like longevity and interactions with humans and transmission and biting, but so I would think for that we would need to think a little bit more about some of those relationships and how humidity might directly impact those traits. So that might come into some of the like demographic traits for the mosquitoes, for instance.
All right, thank you.
Chris, I think you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to go back to your very beginning of your vision of ensemble prediction.
Right.
So I think that's pretty interesting. But I guess I want to if you look at the analog that you're appealing to of the weather forecasting or hurricane forecasting, those are all models of the same type.
Right.
That are being averaged across, but you're suggesting going beyond that and averaging across models of, fundamentally different type. I don't know. Is that what you're thinking of, or?
Well, so that's part of what I'm thinking of, and I recognize that sort of like looking at the, quantitative outputs of those models is not something that we might be able to do in terms of like comparing them. I guess what I'm interested in is we have all these different types of models that take into account different sort of data sources and can predict things, for instance, like expectation for increases in cases based on climate, or looking at potentially increases in cases based on Google search trends. So one of my students has looked at sort of how people searching for things like mosquitoes and dengue can actually impact, or not impact, but how it's associated with increases in dengue in the data. And so my thinking here is that by taking these pieces and sort of outlining kind of what I've called these windows of risk, but these sort of periods in which some of the models might suggest that we're going to see increases in cases, and thinking about like, well, how many of these models are suggesting that, and what are they using to suggest that, is part of what I'm thinking of. I'm not necessarily saying that we can take all of these models and take the quantitative output and compare them in a meaningful way to make predictions in the same way that weather models are made, for instance, or weather predictions are made.
Okay, yeah, it's an interesting thought.
But that's something that I definitely would love to communicate a little bit more with the sort of weather and climate community on, and thinking about what we can do, I guess, and how we can do that.
Yeah, Hans? If Chris was done, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you might be muted, Hans, if you had your hand up.
Hans is
Okay.
muted. Can you
I think
unmute?
so, yeah. I can't.
Yeah, I can.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
Yes, yes, I'm here. I'm here. You can even see me. But I didn't have a question, honestly. So my hand must have hovered over the raised hand. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
But let me
Oh,
say
no
thank you for a good talk. I mean, I really enjoyed this talk.
No, thank you.
It was the only question I really had was when you study the effect of increasing temperature from zero current temperature plus whatever up to 1.5 degrees, 2.5 degrees. most of the curves kept the same shape, except the one sort of collapsed on one end. Can you explain that?
Yeah, let me go back to that. So yeah, this one where we sort of started to see this break here.
Yes.
So my thinking here is that there is some we're at or near some kind of like threshold, I guess, in terms of the temperature ranges that we're in for the introduction time. And this, so let's see, so this dip here kind of follows the dip that we're seeing, but then all of these curves you can kind of see like start to have an increase. And so what I'm thinking is going on here, and what we've sort of looked into, is that this strange kind of dip is a combination of this period for our introduction sort of leading to lower cases as we're sort of increasing the timing of introduction towards the end of the year. However, what we're seeing here in terms of the increase in cases and how this is like starting to kind of increase as we get towards the end of the year, or sorry, down here, is magnified when things are a little bit warmer. And there's something going on here where we're kind of at that cusp of like, you know, increasing the time leading to decreases, but then increasing the time sort of leading to increases. And I don't know that we entirely have a fully formed answer to that yet. But I think this is at some sort of period where the behavior is changing in terms of the timing of introduction, at least. I don't know if that helps.
Okay. Well, yes.
I think,
it seems like it's sort of a resonance phenomenon. Is that a possibility?
I'm sorry, what was that?
A resonance phenomenon?
Potentially, yeah. I think that could be part of what's happening.
Two periods somehow interfering with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. This is something I haven't really gone back to in a while, but I should go back to and try to think more about that particular period in the model.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I was just going to ask about, you mentioned that you had fit the model to produce these incidence rates.
Mm-hmm.
How was that done? Was that sort of fitting the parameters to the data that you had available, curve fits to the data, and then using those fits as parameters for the model, or?
Yeah, so we took the deterministic version of the model, and we have a couple of parameters. One in particular sort of drives the mosquito population size in the model. All the other bits sort of drive the seasonality and the magnitude of the rates, but this kind of sets our carrying capacity effectively. And so what we did for this was we estimated that particular parameter to get the dynamics of the cases to match the data using a least squares algorithm.
Okay. Okay, yeah, this is really interesting. So there's some methods in data assimilation. One that we've used with an SCIR model, but modeling COVID amongst different ethnic populations in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ensemble smoothing with multiple data assimilation, but you can have fairly high dimensional parameter estimation to go through. And what you do is you're basically running your model with a bunch of guesses at your parameters and then assimilating the data that you had. In our case, it was deaths and reported cases, etc. And then trying to obtain those parameters so that just as you did, you reproduce the data with the dynamics. So yeah, it'd be interesting to talk about that. It's also maybe some connections with weather to data assimilation if you were forecasting and things that would be interesting. And also one other comment, because this is so interesting to me. Chris's question about these different model types and averaging over them. One way that that's sort of done in weather these days and is fairly new is to have an AI that is trained to take those different inputs and then produce a forecast, which is kind of interesting, so that you don't, in a sense, you just don't worry about it. You train something to do it, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it'd be interesting to talk more if you want.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, cool. Well, unless there's any other questions. Okay, then yeah, let's thank our speaker. There's a little clapping emoji down there in Meet if you want to hit it. And yeah, thanks everybody, and yeah, we'll be next week. And yeah, thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.